I'm done. I would love to hear your thoughts and comments. If you have any questions, my most probable answer is going to be, I have no idea. I have no idea. Yes?
I could ask you to use your microphones because we are recording this, so we want to make sure all the questions get on.
Okay, so one question that occurs to me, I put the data, the two lines crossing, showing that people who are more sexist were more likely to vote for Trump. But isn't it also follow that if, are people who live in Ohio more sexist than people who live in California, right? I mean, there's some kind of a correlation. So what would explain that?
You're probably right. There's probably a greater preponderance of both the symbolic racism, symbolic sexism, and overt of both kinds in certain parts of the country than in others. It's probably correlated with education level as well. I don't want to speak about my adopted home state in broad strokes and say they're all a bunch of racist and sexist. They're not. But there's probably a difference. And again, in an election this close, to be able to parse one out and isolate and say that was the thing that caused it versus something else, I don't know. But you're probably right. I don't have data on it, but I would say you're probably right. Yeah.
I'm really glad that I'm not a political scientist because just, this many months later, listening to this, I'm like getting really emotional. Not okay with this. So you probably started giving this talk a few weeks after, you've been studying this, but how long after the election were you out speaking about what happened, looking at this data? And
It was the next day, wasn't it?
Yeah.
We had a forum. Yeah, the very next
Okay.
day. Yeah.
So that's not my question, but I'm just saying, that's, pull yourself up out of bed and
Right.
and
Trying to make sense
go.
of what I didn't expect. Yeah.
So it's just something that you mentioned, and I think it was kind of an offhanded comment, but you said that you don't believe that amongst women there is this overt or hostile sexism.
I wouldn't say a lot, but do you think there's more than I think?
Well, so my question for you is, and I know that you're a political scientist, not in media studies, but my question for you is that, again, the shock that I think there's a lot more than I knew about amongst women. And that the media portrayal of it is even more shocking to me. So just maybe a little bit of reflection on that statement that you made, and if you think it's more than you thought there was amongst women.
I don't know about the hostile, total blatant sexist stuff, but I think that my guess would be that the extent of women who support the notion of traditional roles for men and women is far more widespread than I ever would have thought it would be. Maybe that goes to my question to Stacy, the Speavers I talked about at the beginning, where I was shocked that women weren't feeling more empowered.
So that was the symbolic.
Yeah, my notion of symbolic racism.
Right.
I saw some interviews with women who were saying, I just don't think a woman should be president. And I tried to find data on that, the extent to which women, most research on sexism looks at it from the standpoint of men who have these sexist attitudes towards women. I couldn't find much about women having those points of view towards women. And I think that's a lot of what's going on. But I just couldn't get any data on it. But I do think you're right, there's a lot of that going on.
Yeah, and I think that, in social media and other places, Reddit and places where people go to speak and they're anonymous, basically, that so much of that hostile sexism from women is being uncovered, and it is shocking to me.
One thing that I had a hard time wrapping my head around was how not well Hillary Clinton did among the women who did vote. And I heard a lot of women say, first off, it's offensive to say that because I'm a woman, I'm going to vote for Hillary. There's a whole lot more going on. Demography is not destiny. So because I'm a woman doesn't mean I share her views on abortion or on social issues or on anything else. I'm not the Republican woman. But I also heard a lot of women say, I totally support a woman as president, just not her. And I wonder how much of that is really just not her, as opposed to, I'm actually not all that comfortable with a woman as president. And it's hard to disentangle this kind of stuff. Sure.
I think where you do find some literature on hostile sexism would be the mommy wars, the working women versus the women who actually love their children and stay home to raise them. I share the same. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking I should be taking my blood pressure because it's just. I am so curious about your thoughts on the slide where you said that Hillary had some weaknesses. Benghazi, the emails, although now we're finding evidently she's not the only one who has problems with in that regard.
Yeah.
But was so surprising to me is that Trump, he was Teflon, no matter how horrible he did. So it makes me think that sexism is so deep-seated. And we gloss over it. It does rear its ugly head when you get women in a room and kids are young kids. You do see it quite a bit. My neighborhood is like living with the Stepford wives. It's just unbelievable. But can you talk a little bit about the fact that not only what, her presumed weaknesses, but how awful he was and the things that would have sunk anybody else? Is sexism at the heart of that?
I think there's two things going on. Certainly sexism is a part of it. The other part of it, though, I think the fundamental dynamic in American politics in 2016 was not liberal conservative. It was inside establishment mainstream versus outside change. And I think Bernie Sanders, had he been the nominee, would have won the election rather handily, not exclusively for sexist reasons, although certainly partly, but because he would have been the other change candidate. And it's hard to disentangle the role of one versus the other. I can't explain how Trump won. I mean, I put up all the explanations on the wall, and sexism, certainly, and none of them make any sense to me. I mean, I can't imagine how, and frankly, I think he's a disgusting human being, and completely unqualified, and on any dimension, and how that person was elected president, I'm still struggling to understand. And the role of gender on Hillary's part and sexism and the other things, but the one explanation that does make sense to me is change. And one other thought, just a second, Carmen. One other thought is that I know a lot of people who bit their tongue and held their nose and voted for him because they couldn't bring themselves to vote for a Democrat. Not voting at all is a dereliction of their citizen duty, and so he's what's left. And I know many people who voted for him on one promise and one promise only, and that was, there's a vacancy in the Supreme Court and we want someone on our side to fill it. And on that count, he certainly came through for them with Neil Gorsuch. That's exactly who those folks wanted to see, that type of person, exactly who they wanted to see on the court. So in some senses, I can understand certain perspectives of voting for Trump. But as far as explaining, Carmen?
Thanks so much, Steve. I'm not sure where in the three kinds of sexism we can fit self-hatred, as you mentioned, or colonization, women being self-colonized. I think in terms of explanatory frameworks, we have to look at that. And more specifically, I'm thinking about education or the lack thereof. Because as I sort of was eventually able to start reading the articles where journalists were traveling around the country and interviewing people and women who voted for Trump, and trying to understand, trying to follow and understand their reasoning, these are women, who voted for him. I just kept coming back to the idea of a lack of education. Or more specifically, and kind of getting back to the Ohio point or the Florida point or whatever, what kinds of education girls and young women have, which allows them to kind of go through their life and their development process and then get to a point where they'll vote for somebody like Donald Trump. So I guess, I don't know. Thank heavens we all work at a university and we can make some impact, but I still worry about what's happening in Ohio and Kentucky and Louisiana and places like that where education, textbooks, discussions of history are retrograde or behind. And how can we possibly expect women to behave differently if they don't have that opportunity for educational kind of transformation? So I want to be optimistic, but it's a pretty steep hill.
There's a lot of research in political science that shows that women tend to self-select themselves out of seeking higher office because the standards are so different for women than for men, and the process is so much more difficult for women than for men. So the many capable women who would be quite good in politics and other positions of authority in society opt out of it because they face barriers that men just don't face, and so they figure why bother. A kind of a related point to what you said, I read, you might have read the book Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. I read it to try and understand Trump voters, and I still don't understand Trump voters, but I did at least understand the perceptions in places like Ohio and Appalachia, places that are not doing well in this country, that have been left behind by the economic recovery, that is focused mainly at the top. The frustration that they have with establishment Washington, and the willingness on their part to cast a vote like a vote for Trump, which might not even be in their own economic interest, but at least it's a vote for change. And I still say that if Bernie had been the candidate, he would have gotten enough of those change votes to have won the election. How much of Bernie versus Hillary is sexism at its root, I don't know. Yeah, question.
I kind of have a two-part question. So towards the end of your talk, you mentioned that the speeds of progression in terms of the battle against racism and the battle against sexism are not the same. And my two-part questions would be, like, first, what do you think was the reason in terms of sort of the different rate of progression? And second, if sort of, the battle against racism, for example, is more successful, then what would be the lessons that, say, can be learned by, those who want to fight against sexism to, borrow from the other side of the battle?
I'm going to fall mainly on my stock answer, which is I have no idea. But, one thing, I was thinking about this, when Trump said that Clinton doesn't have a presidential look, in some ways he was speaking, that is literally true. We've never seen a president who looks female. And I think the optics matter a lot. I think seeing someone, for many people in public to see someone doing something and to have it be okay and be able to say, oh, well that's not as weird as I thought, that needs to happen. So we've seen a black man be president, and now that no longer seems like a weird thing. That hasn't happened for women yet. I think my sense of the first part of your question is that I think the drag of sexist gender stereotypes is perhaps stronger in politics, at least, than maybe racist stereotypes. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on either one of those things, but that's just my sense. But there was a time when seeing a woman in the military looked weird, or seeing a woman firefighter looked weird, or seeing a woman referee an NBA basketball game was odd. And now all those things have happened, and it just don't seem, they're just, okay, that's whatever. A female president of a university, that's not odd anymore. But that has to happen in the presidency, and then it won't seem odd anymore. But how we get past that first time is troubling. And again, I go back to, if Hillary had been the candidate, the nominee in 2008, it would have already happened. And maybe we'd be having this discussion about, maybe Trump would have beaten Obama in 2016. I don't know.
Thinking about a cultural element here, thanks Beverly. Is there something about American culture, this idea of the nuclear codes, only a man can have it? Because a lot of other countries,
Right.
although many of the leaders have been, wives and daughters of male leaders, and but there have been a lot of women leaders in other countries.
Sure.
And I remember when in India, not very long ago, they were willing to elect a foreigner, the Italian wife of one of the Gandhis. People were setting themselves on fire, saying only you can be our leader. And India is a pretty sexist country, And so it made me wonder, is it that they can't trust a woman with the nuclear codes and all those Fox guys, talking in such blatantly sexual terms about PMS and stuff. Hillary's way past PMS. But
Glad you said that. Yeah. Society's far more backwards from most perspectives in the United States have had women heads of state. The Philippines, not exactly a progressive country on women's rights or human rights generally, has had a woman president. And why not here, I don't know. I mean, I'm stunned at some of the comments that we saw. I can't imagine, maybe I shouldn't go there. The one guy, Pete Santilli, the guy, the radio shock jock guy, there is no way it would occur to anyone to say, If the nominee had been Bernie Sanders, no one anywhere on the right, on the fringe, no matter how far on the fringe, would have said Bernie Sanders needs to be tried and convicted and shot in the penis. Never. And yet that was the language he went to for Hillary Clinton. It's just, is it cultural in the U.S.? I don't know. Carmen.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I think rape culture, I mean, we need to say it out loud. I mean, I think that's a major unspoken dynamic here. And the aggressiveness and the physical kind of body language of those speakers and so many others. I remember watching that debate when Trump kept going on about stamina, and I was thinking, this is sexual. He's talking about sexual stamina. That's what he's talking about, because it made no sense, with in other terms. So I think rape culture is something that there's a distinctive aspect to it in American society, and it's violence and domination and other things. So I just wanted to, it's disturbing and distressing, but I think we need to say it.
There was also was it the first debate, the town hall setting, where they're walking around in front of each other?
Yes.
And he was sort of looming over her, kind of menacing, lurking. Yes. Yeah. And he made a comment later about that she was standing in front of him and he wasn't impressed. Yeah. Gotcha.
I just had a reflection about his first daughter, Ivanka, and what sort of role she may have played in maybe providing some credibility from a Generation X and millennial perspective. I mean, she just seemed like she was almost like Teflon, always very charismatic, and she even had that Women Who Work campaign platform. So I'm just, curious what you might think about her presence in the campaign, even more so than as a first daughter than his wife.
Yeah, she probably helped him more than Melania did, who tried to stay away. I don't blame her. Stay away from the spotlight and all the criticism. And I think that anytime he has women around him who seemingly have it together, which in many dimensions I think Ivanka does, it has to help him. Maybe legitimize him. My dad isn't this horrible monster that's been portrayed. Even though I think he actually is. But yeah, sure, sure. Yeah.
So I find myself sitting here kind of trying to think beyond the election, right? And when we think about these three types of sexism, right? How do they influence our life and our society and the progress that, that we make for women in leadership? And I'm wondering sort of what's your thought in which one of these three is the most damaging, right? It's, is it the hate, is it the hostile one or symbolic, or could it even be actually this idea of benevolent sexism what really gets in the way of progress?
Now, I would reiterate that I'm making up the symbolic sexism. I think it's there, but that's not in the literature that I know of. It is about racism. I mean, if I were to say, I would say that it's the symbolic and the benevolent. The hostile stuff, I mean, it is what it is, and some men are pigs, and that's just what it is. And hopefully those attitudes, I think they've taken a step forward in recent years and been more normalized than any of us would like. But I think it's the other kinds that are a little troubling. Like, what do you do about benevolent sexism? What do you do about the fact that I hold doors open in my car when a woman gets in my car? I've done that since I was, however old, 12 years old. How big a problem is that? I mean, I should ask you. You don't need me mansplaining this to you. How big a problem is that? And is that the foundation for some of the other more troubling sexist manifestations?
Well, and I was just going to reflect quickly, processing with my mouth apparently on how sort of I'm being a return on investment, but it's the opposite, right? The damage. So hostile, at least it's out there. We know it exists. But then you're talking about normalization of it, right? Then we start to oh, well, we've heard that before. So I personally think that hostile sexism, racism is more damaging than we might say it is, just because it's out there. We seem to think that if it's covert or hidden, that it's more damaging. And I'm not sure that that's what I believe, although I'm just kind of processing this as I think. And so benevolent sexism, to me, of those three, would be the least damaging. Well, I'm just saying though, because like, what is the net effect, right, of someone holding? No, I'm happy to hear. And look, too, we are all, you know, I think, you know, people's experiences, where they come from, you know, in the world or the United States, as well as generations and those kinds of things, explain your personal thoughts about these three types. But for me personally, I think that just because it's out there, oh, we know what we're dealing with. Because I think that for everything that's out there, there's a whole lot more that we don't know.
I guess my realization in the course of the last year or so has been what I thought was just a little bit of it it's much greater than I thought. And that it's being openly expressed has sort of laid that bare a little bit. The notion in political science, the notion behind the symbolic racism, the idea was that there's very little overt sexism or racism left. That racism now is really expressed through this symbolic stuff. Well, I think that literature might revisit itself and say, actually, there's a lot more overt stuff than we wanted to acknowledge. So,
But I'm interested in hearing President Haynes' thoughts on the benevolent sexism.
Well, and probably in my generation, we might have termed it paternalism.
Sure.
And damaging, incredibly so, because one, you don't know it till it's behind you. Because you get a senior faculty member or the dean of your college who says, you know, maybe you really don't want to take the risk and go up for tenure early. Or, my dear, why don't you wait a little? And it all feels like in your best interest, but they're making decisions that put you down, that subvert, that allow you to not be a competitor. And it passes you by, and then you say, that's what it was. And I'm saying in my generation decades ago, and I could say in my lifetime 2 weeks ago. That to me, I agree with you, the hostile shouldn't be something that we say that we get comfortable with. But I worry about our students, for example, and women who say, I've never experienced sexism. And I think, I hope that's true, but I worry they don't even see it and feel it, and it's keeping them from higher aspirations. I made one point to Carmen, because when you were talking, the other piece I was thinking of is, you know, what I was depressed, expected a different outcome, see gender, and saw gender as a big issue. But I will tell you, I've been 22 years as a president, and the percentage of women presidents in this country of universities has not changed in 22 years. So the glass ceiling exists in many places, corporate America, politics, and unfortunately, even in higher ed administration. And I try to tease out from what you said, Steve, and think, why? Why does it still exist when we have a huge proportion of women who are faculty and making it to full professor, right? 20 years ago, you could say it was a pipeline issue. It's not a pipeline issue. And some of it is women not supporting other women.
I'm afraid of a Jill Watts question, but I know she has. I see the wheels spinning in that brain.
Yeah, that's because we team taught together, so you know all the way I think. So, you know what I'm reflecting on is a lot of different things. The question of why 2008 we break one ceiling and 2016 we don't. And in terms of like the ongoing, there's been some progress, but not a lot. But in a lot of ways, what I'm thinking is we're doing what we've rejected, which is we've talked about why she lost and not about why she won. Because she essentially won, you know, and...
She did win the popular vote.
She won.
Yeah.
So, you know, you win and you lose in our system. But
Sure.
so, and I think that there's a national narrative that's been changing in the way we teach history, and maybe not in Ohio, but Ohio's just as probably, you know, racist as it is sexist. So why does it work in 2008 and it doesn't work in 2016? I mean, why is the Electoral College kind of tipping one way and tipping another when it comes to gender versus race? You know,
Yeah.
I'm wondering what you think about that, because essentially she won. So the question could be, well, why did she win, but at the same time lose? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I would say She won in the sense that more people voted for her than voted for Trump. But the American election, as you know very well, doesn't hinge on the popular, hinge on the electoral college vote. And if it were a popular vote election, both candidates would have run a completely different race. Hillary would have spent all her time on the coast seeking every last liberal vote in Berkeley and in New York and Massachusetts you could possibly find. And Trump would have spent all his time in Texas and Oklahoma and the South and getting every conservative, I'm going to use a different word, conservative vote that he could possibly find, and it would have been completely different. So who knows if she would have still won under a different set of rules, one that emphasized the number of votes in the electoral college. I understand less how she lost in those 4 states. And, we mentioned Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan as well. I'm surprised that there wasn't greater turnout among women in those states. I'm surprised that the women's vote didn't break more in her favor in those states, in the same way it did for Obama. And I think you're right, that those states are equally sexist, or racist, if not more so than they are sexist. So I don't have an explanation for how the vote in those states fell that way. And why the polls were wrong in those states. And not just by a little bit, by a lot in some cases. She was comfortably ahead in most pre-election polls in many of those states, and yet somehow lost. I don't know. That's a lame answer to a really good question. Jill's used to that from me. Yeah.
Okay, so then you brought up polls, which obviously was a huge issue, is that polls were wrong.
Well, maybe.
Were polls wrong? I mean, talk to us about the polling, that were people not willing to
Right, okay, so
to say what they really were thinking, right?
the national polls technically were not very wrong. They actually were right. They predicted a narrow Hillary win, which is exactly what happened nationally. All national polls are good at is predicting the popular vote, and they got it within a percentage point, which is pretty good. The polls that were wrong were some of the state polls in places like I just mentioned, and there's a lot of possible issues there. There are smaller sample sizes, so there's larger error possibilities. So there's that maybe. It could be a reluctance to say what you, and people are well aware that Trump was not widely popular in many circles, and so people might have said something like, yeah, I'm not going to vote for him, and actually did end up actually voting for him. There was an election in North Carolina in the 1980s. I talked about this at the Chavs event, where a black man named Harvey Gantt was running against Jesse Helms. Jesse Helms was perhaps the last truly avowed racist senator who was alive, still serving in the United States Senate. It's a horrible man. He said horrible things to fellow senators who were African American. Carol Moseley Braun being one. And in this Gantt-Helms election, Gantt was leading according to the polls going into election day, and Helms won comfortably. And clearly, what was going on was people were saying one thing to pollsters, and then privately while voting doing something else. So that might have been something. Yeah.
So I wonder, as maybe a possible something else to consider is when we look at women in legislators, that's where we find higher numbers, and that's where we can probably do better analysis, right? Instead of the one, prime minister or the president. And I think that we would find ourselves culpable for not electing higher numbers of women legislators. So we don't have this critical mass that we find in other countries like Nicaragua, where I do my research, that is over 50% of women are legislators there. And then we see the election of women. And so I think without without legislation that really compels us to have more equity in terms of who runs and so forth, to have these platforms. And these are easier, as you know, for a parliamentary model than a presidential one. Right. But nevertheless, we have examples of models where there are, it is possible to elect higher numbers of women at the legislators, but we don't talk about that. And so as long as we allow for that, for us to be an industrial nation and to have an abysmal percentage of women in the legislators, then we can continue to expect women to not be successful at the national level, at the presidential level. But I would say that the story, one way that we can tell the story is that a woman won the presidential nominee. That's a story to be told.
Sure. I think some of this lies at the feet of the political parties. It's up to the parties to be involved in recruiting and supporting and funding candidates. And I wonder, how much is going on in terms of sexism and gender bias in that process, who they recruit in the first place and how they support them. I mean, the Democratic Party seemed to have their thumb on the scale in favor of Hillary at the presidential level over Bernie Sanders, as documents later showed. But that doesn't mean that that's going on, you know, at all the lower levels at the county and the state and local level. It's definitely a problem.
And I think, you know, that has me, I've been really thinking a lot about your idea of just symbolic sexism, right? Because, you know, I think it's really scary because it comes disguised as being other things, right? And just like that sort of benevolent idea, and you know, even thinking about your comment about having women in, you know, other parts of our government, and I wonder if it is this idea of symbolic sexism that really gets in the way of that, because I think that you would see less of the hostile acts, right? I think those come out to the forefront and they're loud and visible, right? In something like a presidential election, but perhaps they don't come out so much, right? We wouldn't see those kinds of behaviors when somebody wants to be, you know, a mayor or right or some other kind of position, and so, you know, that could really be sort of the key, the big obstacle. And I've been thinking about something I shared. You know, I was in a panel in our last Tess talk, and you know, it's sometimes it was a very small moment that has really stuck with me because it was my first semester here, and you know, I teach this marketing class, and you know, I tell them I have a PhD, and you know, I'm Dr. Perrin, and I create a question for my exam, and in the exam, the question reads, your marketing professor, comma, Dr. Marketing, right? I don't use my name, right? And I go on to ask them something about marketing. And in all, 100% of my students, in all the answers, when they answered the question, they said, he would do this. He would do that. And there was this word men and women, and I mean, and clearly I'm their professor of marketing, right? But that's sort of the idea that you're getting at with this sort of symbolic sexism. And I don't even recognize it, right? Like I just, you know, if you say Dr. Marketing, I just assume that's got to be a guy, right? Can't be a woman.
Sure. No, I totally agree. I think there's a lot to the idea that many in our society just aren't comfortable with a woman being commander-in-chief. I mean, yeah, for blatantly sexist reasons.
I hate to have to stop this because I think we could go for another couple of hours and try to process. I'm struck by all of the comments in the room, and going back to something that Steve started us off with. What percent of the electorate is women?
52, 53.
And President Haynes says that we don't treat each other well. We don't bring each other along. If all 53%, if women had come out and voted for Hillary, we would not be having this conversation. So I think it's easy for us to say, well, you know, the men treat us this way, but how do we treat each other? And that's the thing that I'm left with, and I'm sure there are many other questions that we can talk about. And Steve, I hope you can join us for some wine and some snacks.
Oh, of course.
And I thank you all very much, but in particular, let's thank our speakers for some excellent